Fat in our bodies is stored in fat cells. Now, you'd think that with all the interest in obesity around the world, we'd know a lot about the fat cell. But in fact, we know relatively little. We don't even know how many we should have in our body and whether that number gets bigger or smaller as life goes by. We suck these fat cells out with liposuction. Do they come back? Do we have a steady state of fat cells? Well, research at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm is beginning to answer some of these questions.
So we make use of a geopolitical phenomenon, which was the Cold War. So during the period of the Cold War, there was a lot of above-ground nuclear bomb testing. And during this period, there was a lot of detonation of carbon-14 in the atmosphere.
Radioactive carbon.
Exactly. So we have the stable isotopes carbon-12 and 13, which are the most highly abundant. And then you have very, very low levels of the radioactive isotope carbon-14 that occur normally. But as a result of all of this bomb testing, we have what we call the bomb spike. And that is that for almost 4,000 years, carbon-14 levels in the atmosphere have been almost completely stable. And then bang, with all this bomb testing, their values shot straight up. And then in 1963, there was a test ban treaty signed, and pretty much banning most above-ground nuclear bomb testing. So ever since then, the C14 values in the atmosphere have been decreasing exponentially. So we can use this to determine the age of cells.
What they do is they carbon date fat cells. That's using radioactive carbon to see whether new cells are created and how long they might live.
So we found that absolutely, adult humans do make new fat cells. On average, obese people are making twice as many fat cells per year as lean people, but this is also balanced by a similar death rate. So actually the rates of production of fat cells did not differ between lean and obese, and we're making about 10% new fat cells every year. But what was really interesting about the study was we looked at a cohort, so we biopsied about 700 people, took fat from them, established the number of their fat cells and the size of their fat cells. And then a cohort of these people lost a significant amount of weight over 2 years. They lost about 35% of their body fat. We then biopsied them again and looked at the number of their fat cells, the size of their fat cells. And they had significantly reduced the size of their fat cells, but they had absolutely no change in the number. So if we combine this with our radiocarbon analysis showing that we are actually making about 10% new fat cells every year, the truly interesting question is, why is the body not listening to the change in energy balance and making less? It seems that this is a set process, and understanding what regulates that is really the key question now.
So what happens with obese people is that they've usually grown more fat cells in childhood, about 2.5 times more than in thin people. And this is a curse that stays with them for the rest of their lives. So even though they may lose weight, they've got all these fat cells waiting to fill up again. And each of these cells lives for 10 years.
On average, yeah. About 50% of the fat mass in our body is replaced every 8 to 9 years.
And what about the fat inside cells? How's that being turned over?
The fat mass is really the product of the number of fat cells you have and the size of the fat cells. And the size of the fat cells is the result of how much lipid, how much fat you have inside the fat cell. So the next question we wanted to look at was, do lean and obese people and the metabolic disease as well have a different way and ability to put fat into the fat cells and move fat out of the fat cells? And actually, unlike what we found when we're looking at the cell turnover, we found no difference between lean and obese. We found that there really is a difference in the metabolic processing of the fat between lean and obese people, such that obese people have an increased ability to move fat and store it into the fat tissue, and they have a decreased rate of removing the fat out of the fat cells and out of the fat tissue.
So they can get hit both ways. Not only do they have more fat cells, they can load fat in and then find it harder to get it out.
You can see why so many factors contribute to really the poor outcomes that we're seeing in people maintaining significant weight loss once already reaching an obese state. On average, the lipid is completely exchanged in a fat cell every sort of about 6 times during the lifespan of a fat cell. But if we separate this average into lean and obese, it's sort of an average lifespan of the fat inside a fat cell lives for about 1 to 1.2 years in a lean person versus closer to 2 years in an obese person.
Any clues as to why?
No, this is now the key question. I mean, so how does a fat cell, if we're showing that 10% are born every year, 10% dying, what causes a fat cell to die? What stimulates a fat cell to be born? What regulates this process? These are all very key questions that we don't have answers for yet.
And in your study, was there any relationship between the amount of physical activity and fat turnover?
It's a really interesting question because certainly when it comes to the issue of the fact that lean people have a different ability to remove fat from the fat mass, it would be very interesting to look at that in the context of level of activity. In this study, we don't have any information about the level of activity of our lean versus obese people, so it's very hard to factor that in. In follow-up studies, we're hoping to do this same analysis looking at lipid turnover in high-end athletes. So really, one should be focusing on never becoming to the obese state in the first place, because once you get there, it's very difficult to reverse.
And that's why childhood is so important.
Absolutely. If you look at the statistics on children that are obese in childhood and the success rate of not being obese in adulthood, it's almost zero. It's a very strong indicator of lifelong obesity.